Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we offer a brief lesson from a section of today's reading, and then we examine a single relevant question that passage points us to. Today I'm joined by Sheryl, Daughety, and we are looking at a passage from Psalm 18, and I'll read a few verses of that. It says, "Then the earth quaked and trembled, the foundations of the mountains shook, they quaked because of his anger, smoke poured from his nostrils. Fierce flames leaped from his mouth, glowing coals blazed forth from him. He opened the heavens and came down. Dark storm clouds were beneath his feet." And it just goes on with this description of these acts of God. So in in the Psalms, there are these highs and lows that run throughout them. Things like God coming down from heaven, and he acts in such a way that he disturbs the depths of the earth. The psalmist is drawn up out of the water. Enemies may rise up, but God humbles them and brings them down so they are unable to rise again. And so David is considered the author of this particular psalm according to the title. So in most Bibles, it will list him as the author. Specifically, the psalm is said to have either been composed or sang when God delivered him from his enemies, particularly when he was delivered from Saul. There's a couple of things Scripture teaches us about that. David was able to escape Saul when Saul was pursuing him by hiding in rocks and crags of the surrounding area. And it's interesting that all the 9 titles of God in verses 1 and 2 seem to recall his experience of hiding in rocks and caves. All of them carry this idea. So all of the titles of God except the first one are concrete expressions. It's quite possible that the first one, strength, intends to communicate that God is the strong one. And then the imagery of a cliff, a crag, a place of safety, a peak, a haven, to hide in, all seem to recall those times when David was running and hiding from Saul. Verse 3 to 6, you kind of get this summary of what the psalm is about. And he repeats how he's been delivered from death. And he's talking about when you need deliverance, God will deliver you. And then verses 7 through 15, which was where we're going to kind of focus in on today, he begins to talk about God working through the natural elements. He describes God's rescue in terms of mighty storms, the shaking of the earth. God is described as coming down to earth, but being shielded by thick clouds so that he remains hidden. He describes God present in the storm, but he's still unable to see him. I think this is something all of us can relate to, and we'll probably talk about that a little bit, how God's present in our storms. It's entirely possible that that natural events like storms and wind were involved in some of the deliverances of David, so they might have been actual occurrences that he experienced. But other places in the Psalms and the wisdom books, he uses this language metaphorically as a way of saying God was in the events that brought about deliverance. Thundering was a way of describing God was coming. You would find that in other places. God's arrows are a way to refer to lightning, smoke coming from his nostrils, God riding on the wings of wind. All of these are dynamic ways of describing God moving through the natural elements to deliver this psalmist, or David in particular, from death. And then he says, God drew me out of the waters, deep waters, that takes up this idea of deathly powers that threaten people, which was mentioned in the introduction. Water is often used in the Old Testament as a symbol of death, destruction, and calamity. Interestingly, the phrase drew me out is the same word for the name of Moses. So that's what the name Moses means. It means drew me out, who was called drawn out because he was pulled out of the waters of the Nile. This is the only other occurrence of that word in the entire Old Testament. And I think he intentionally uses this reference to compare himself to Moses. He doesn't intend this in an arrogant way, like I'm as good as Moses or I'm the same as Moses. Rather, he's describing God's indescribable deliverance from death, comparable to how God delivered Moses from that very water, the Nile, in which he should have drowned. based on Pharaoh's command. So, Sheryl, I have a couple of questions to kind of talk about. In your opinion, does God use the natural elements like storms, wind, water, thunder, lightning to accomplish his work? And if he does, what do we do with the destruction that is caused? How do we sort through the destruction that happens from those same things?
So I feel like the Old Testament is a perfect place to look for those examples that we can see of when he obviously did use lots of natural resources to make different things happen.
Right.
And one of the particular ones I can think of is, Jonah. Not only the storm, but the whale.
Mm-hmm.
And then we also think about Moses, of course, with the Israelites. And there's a variety of things that happen there, anything from locusts to eventually when they actually get to leave Egypt, they walk across a parted sea. Whether people think they can take that back to whatever explanation they want to give, a low tide, whatever it may be. And I actually just recently heard a lot of conversations about people trying to figure out whether or not when Jesus was crucified, because we had an eclipse, if there was an eclipse that happened at that time. Right. And if there was, then it's still, the timing could not have perfectly lined up without God having made sure that it did.
Right.
And it made much more of a statement at that time for all of those things to line up and for there to have literally been darkness when he had died.
I think it's easier for us to look at the moments where we know God worked, whether it's Jonah and the fish or the waters parting. Those same waters become destructive for the Egyptians. Their salvation
That's right.
for the Israelites. And I think we're fine with accepting that God works when it turns out in our favor.
But I mean, it didn't turn out in the Egyptians' favor in that example.
That's correct. And so in our case, the time I remember, and I think this has made this podcast 2 or 3 times, but the time I remember hearing most people talk about natural elements being God's judgment was when Katrina hit New Orleans, and I've always thought that was a farce because most of the things people were talking about New Orleans needing to be judged for were spared, and the people that suffered the most were the poor. We experienced some natural element destructions here. You and I have lived through multiple hurricanes, and though we may have gotten out fairly unscathed personally, there were lots of people who lost their entire livelihood, their homes. In more recent years in Bertie County, they've had multiple tornadoes touch down and destroy homes. What do you tell people? It's one thing when there's deliverance that comes from it. What do you tell people when it's destruction? Is it still God at work? Is it really judgment, or is it just the course of nature?
Well, I would say, especially in the case of New Orleans and other situations like that, because, where we live, there's all this coastline. I think that we want to think that because we want to live somewhere and we love the place that we live, that it's inhabitable. But if you're living next to the ocean or you're living in a place that is below sea level and there's just like a levee holding all that water back, you can't expect to never have any issues with that or any problems, especially in the case of something like a hurricane that's so forceful and can bring in so much wind and,
water.
So much of a tide change, yes, with all the water. Sometimes I think we want to over spiritualize some of that stuff on the other side of this, where some of it is just, like you said, the course of nature and things that we should be expecting to happen. I have said that often to my husband about the road that goes from the Outer Banks, the southern part, that takes you all the way to Cape Hatteras. how many times did we see it get washed out, or covered in sand? And I said, the ocean is trying to take that back. It's supposed to be an inlet, obviously,
Right.
but we just keep fighting it because people want to live there, and we make so much money off of the
And
tourism that happens
and we
there.
spend a lot of money to
Oh yeah,
to
we do.
it's not like it's, oh, we need room for poor people to go. I mean, those are very, very expensive places to own homes.
It is, and I've heard people make. I've listened and watched people make the statement that, well, we love it and we're determined. We're determined to live there. And I wonder at what point it just should be common sense for us to say, we're continuing to spend our money and so much effort in our life to do the same process over and over again, and nothing's changing. Should we actually
Right.
consider moving?
I would agree. Bertie County, we have a campus there. It's next door to where you and I live. Had some severe flooding just 10 years apart or
Yeah.
so, and both of them were described as 500-year floods, that.
You're talking about like downtown Windsor.
Yeah, yeah. And, there were some churches that got flooded, and have since moved, relocated. And you would think people would understand the risks that they're taking. But all of us think we're exempt, right?
From some things, I think so.
I think we all want to believe we're exempt. I'm smarter than that. I can do that and it not bother me. And I think we have to be careful. And there are some things I just have. I don't know that it is. The things I have questions about is it God's immediate response to something, right? Because I think that's how we try to say, if we're talking about New Orleans, and that if somebody believed that was the judgment of God, they would have to believe that based on 50 or 60 years of history,
right?
Not some long time ago. But the way I read Scripture and I understand eternity, like that hurricane could have been something God set in motion ages ago. Now, the other question becomes, did he set it in motion ages ago because he knew ages ago what was going to happen? That's hard to tell, but some things are just, they call them, and even in insurance policies, they call them acts of God.
Yes, yeah.
Do. Your legal documents say acts of God because they understand there's not a lot of control over it.
And when you think back, especially in some of those examples of the Old Testament, in most of those cases that I can think of, there was some warning ahead of time.
Yeah.
There was, you need to do this. This is what I'm asking you to do. This is what I'm commanding you to do. And there was always people who just said, no, I'm not going to do it. Or they were hard-hearted, they were stubborn, and they decided not to. And it seems to me that in those cases, I don't want to call it a last resort, but it was like it had escalated to the point that God said, okay, I'm going to use this to get your attention, and you're no longer going to have a choice but to listen to what I'm telling you. You're going to be forced into this situation now because you've chosen not to be.
So can you think of a time in your life when you know that you were delivered from something that should have taken your life?
Yes. I can think of a couple of different physical situations, and I can also think of spiritual situations. The main one that comes to my mind that I would say for a physical situation is a car accident that I got into when, I don't know, I must have been like 19-ish, somewhere around there. And I was traveling. I shouldn't have been where I was, to tell you the truth. But anyway, I was. And I got into a car accident at night. It was my fault because I pulled out in front of somebody unintentionally. And they hit me in the driver's side going, I don't know, they were probably going 55 or 60.
Wow.
And I was in a car, and it had the thing in the, what is it called? In the middle.
Console.
Yeah, the console in the middle. And I'm really small, so I literally had to wedge my hips out from in between the door and the console.
Wow.
And it was one of those situations where you see people talk about it on TV, but then you experience it, and it really was slow motion. Like, I watched the window shatter and all of the doors just coming in on me. And when the ambulance showed up and the police, he looked at me and he said, "Where's the driver of this car?" I'm assuming you might have been the passenger. And he said, "I like the ambulance has already gotten whoever this person is." And I said, "No, it's me." And he just looked at me and said, "It's impossible that you just got out of this car." And I said, "I did." And he said, "How did you survive this?" Because if you looked at it, there was like this much room
Right.
in between the door and the console. And I said, "I don't know. I think it's just because I'm small, And of course, now I realize it absolutely had to be because God was protecting me.
Sure.
Because even if I had have gotten physically hurt in that situation, I just believe my pelvis and everything would have been crushed, which I think would have caused internal
Yeah,
injuries.
lots of
Yeah.
long-term issues. Yeah.
And I don't think I fully appreciated it at the time. And then as time went by and I looked at the pictures of it, I was like, my gosh, it really is a miracle that I just got up and walked away from it.
Those are scary times.
Uh-huh.
And
Because you see how differently it does turn out for people.
Sure, one of the things that would benefit us is to appreciate what God has kept us for.
Yep.
That He kept us for something. A question that I have learned to ask myself frequently recently, in recent years, is this what God kept me around for? Am I, because it's so easy to get distracted doing so many other things that you go, I can't believe God saved my life just so I could be doing this.
Well, I also think it has to help us stay focused on the fact that He does have something prepared for you to do, that you had not completed at that point.
Right. I would agree with that. Well, thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you'll be back with us tomorrow as we continue our conversation around the Bible reading.